And we're live with the podcast for all seasons. My name's Josh Mundy, and today is episode 4 of our third season of a podcast for all seasons. With me, as always, is my co-host Eric Joseph. Today we are going to be doing a review of Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice, or Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. So obviously the movie is pretty infamous at this point, if for not only its so-called abysmal ratings via Rotten Tomatoes, but the film's been pretty divisive amongst fans. We're going to address a lot of those things today. We might try to squeeze in a few other things in review. We'll kind of play it by ear as far as those things are concerned. But Eric, why don't you introduce yourself, get us started, and just I don't know, let's mash up the first topic you want to go over. We kind of want to do a little bit of back and forth today, and so we're not droning on. We've got a lot to say about this film, so just dig in and hopefully we get some good insights. Eric?
Hi, Josh, and hi to everybody listening. This is Eric Joseph, and as Josh said, we will be reviewing Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice today. I will say that I do have a review posted over at darkknightnews.com, and if you're listening to this podcast on either Dark Knight News, DC Comics News, or our blog site Multiverse Entertainment, I will provide a link within the article to my written review so you can go over that. I mean, I'll probably touch on a few of those points, but keep in mind I wrote that review almost 2 weeks ago, even though the review was written a few days before it was published, but I obviously held off on posting it for a few days for reasons, respect for Zack Snyder, etc. I almost feel like I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage right now because I've seen the film only once. Josh has seen it twice. He and I first saw it on Monday the 21st. We were at an advanced screening, so that was pretty cool, but technically WB has still not gotten my money. I was supposed to see it last weekend with family, but that didn't materialize. So hopefully I will be seeing it this weekend and help give it a decent week 2 box office gross, because hey, it's up to me to make sure it makes tens of millions of dollars this weekend, right? As for the critics score, which we will go into later, yeah, this was a little bit of a divisive movie. Critics hated it. Last I saw, it was at 29% on Rotten Tomatoes, but even in my review, I said I thought this would be a divisive movie, even though I loved it. I just think that it's darker than a lot of people have expected. It's definitely not the Marvel formula of movies, which, as you know, is more family friendly, and for the most part, barring Captain America: The Winter Soldier, they're more comedic. And I mean, I'm not meaning to slam Marvel movies. As many of you know, Josh and I love Marvel movies. For me, more so specifically, Marvel Phase 1. When they were at Paramount. But it's just DC movies don't have to be Disney, and it seems to be doing well enough financially with its darker tone. I just think critics have come to expect something that's lighthearted, because things that The Dark Knight had been praised for 8 years ago during its theatrical release, Batman versus Superman is now getting slammed for. And I just, with Marvel having such a dominance at the box office and DC normally only having one movie, if that, per year, it's, like I said, it's just kind of set a precedent. And critics have really just not, they've never really liked action movies as a whole. And not to get carried away here, but I think it's something that needs to be said. They complain that action movies and comic book movies shouldn't try to have any sort of intelligence to them. And personally, As I'll elaborate in a bit, I do think Batman versus Superman had a little bit more depth to it than we're used to seeing in some comic book movies. And whether you think Batman versus Superman had depth or not, whether you liked it, hated it, or you were lukewarm, the fact is many critics who aren't familiar with comic books, because let's face it, as geek journalists and podcasters, we're of a different breed than most movie critics. We're not stuffy old men who like only art house movies or something of that nature. Uh, they still see comic books as a deviant form of entertainment, as they also do video games, and they probably think their every comic book is probably what was in the golden age, or um, comic books that you would get inserted into a Happy Meal. Batman saves a security guard. That must be what all comic books are, right? Lots of people still see it as a lighthearted fare. When The Dark Knight came out in 2008, so many critics thought this dark Batman was such a novel idea, and they had been familiar with the Dark Knight Returns comic from Frank Miller, they thought that was really the only dark Batman. They thought that 70 some years of Batman had all been of the Adam West variety. It just shows that there's this umbrella of ignorance around comic book culture as a whole. And you'd think that living in this golden age of superhero movies, there would be more acceptance of it, but it's just that people are really only looking at movies. And although, as we constantly say on this show, people who read comic books are actually in the minority, whether people want to admit it or not. But it's, you'd think they'd have more respect for them these days, and quite frankly, that's not the case, because as popular as superheroes are, so many people have Iron Man shirts. You talk to somebody and you say, even some people say, like, yeah, I love Batman, Iron Man, whatever. It's like, yeah, I read the comic books, and there's still some people that will call you a dork or whatever, and it's just such an odd double standard. And although I've kind of run on a tangent here, Josh, briefly, before we get into the movie, do you have any response to what I just said?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that I wanted to touch on at one point in the show or another was the critical reviews. I mean, and we'll get into that more as we kind of get into our various review. And if we haven't already said so, I mean, we will be getting into very spoilery territory, and we're going to try not to spoiler all of the major beats and all of the major, twists and turns, because there are a few in the film, but we will be spoiling some major beats. So just prepare for that. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, I would definitely see it first and then maybe come back and check us out. But one thing that I think is problematic is, Rotten Tomatoes, it's kind of, the be all end all. And I had heard one person say something along the lines of, no one cares what Rotten Tomatoes opinion is. And it's like, well, it's not Rotten Tomatoes opinion. They're an aggregate site. But I think that often people don't even understand what that means. And they don't understand how Rotten Tomatoes aggregates their score. And I think that Metacritic maybe does a better job of aggregating critical scores than Rotten Tomato does. So what Rotten Tomato does is they give a so-called fresh or a rotten review. And it's based on a percentage. So I believe if you are above 65% on your rating, and that's out of 10, so you'd have to be a 6.5 out of 10 at least to get a 65%. And then they will consider it a fresh movie. Anything lower than that is considered rotten, and it goes into a generic good versus bad category. So when people say, oh, it has a 29% on Rotten Tomatoes, that does not mean it has a 3 out of 10 average rating by the critics. It actually has an average rating of 5 out of 10, which I think is still tantamountly low, but it's considerably higher than, 50% is considerably higher than 30%, obviously. But I think that what Metacritic does is they do take the general average of the scores rather than a generic good versus bad or quote unquote rotten versus fresh rating. So I will say this. I mean, I don't let critics tell me what movies to like. There are movies that I loved that critics panned. Boondock Saints is an example. It also has a 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. It has a 91% by audiences of people who liked it, and its average rating. There are movies that come out that critics really don't care for and that fans still like. The Transformers movies are an example. They make a lot of money and audiences seem to like them. That doesn't necessarily make them good movies if it makes a lot of money. But I guess my point is that the audience tends to score these movies a lot higher than the critics. I do think that this movie's getting a lot of critical guff that isn't necessarily deserved. And Eric touched on a point that that the critics seemed to find the darkness and the grittiness and the realism of the Nolan films to be a refreshing change in the comic book scene. Although as a comic book fan, we knew that it was not a change at all. It was finally, we were getting a representation of comics on screen as they are written. Not to say that the Burton films, Burton Batman films were light-hearted affair or anything like that. They had their moments of humor, but they were quite dark as well. But the point that I'm making is the 71% of fans on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's, I think, something like 70% over at IMDb, and I think Metacritic's got 70 or 71%, liked the film, and it's got an average rating of 3.8 out of 5, so that'd be 7.6 out of 10. It's a considerable difference. So there's a disconnect between fans and the critics. I wanted to touch on that, and I think that looking at Rotten Tomatoes, it's a little bit disingenuous. I think that it's almost by intent. What's very interesting is the fact that something like a Rotten Tomatoes really has the ability to make or break the expectations and the outcomes of a film. It's actually kind of frightening in a way. I don't necessarily think that, I mean, I think that the critics' place in society is to say, hey, here's what is good and here's the reasons why I believe that. And, you know, is there something more than objective or subjective good or bad? And the answer is yes, sure, there is. But I think that there's so much subjectivity and objectivity to film that there are lots of things that people really, really, really hate that critics really, really love. And all you have to do is look no further than the latest, Oscar winners, and just see if you can name one out of the 5 films that were there, or if you had seen those films. Hell, if you'd even seen them at your theater on the marquee. So there's definitely a disconnect between the critical mindset and the fans' mindset. And I think going forward, that'll kind of speak to my thoughts on the movie. But go ahead, Eric. I've been too long-winded at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say, when we're talking audience score versus critic score, Rotten Tomatoes audience score is around 70%, give or take. I believe Cinema Score is at a B. And listening to people we know, Facebook posts, and just seeing fans post in random Facebook links, 70-30 seems to be accurate for the public, for people who liked it versus people who hated it. Granted, some of those people are lukewarm, but the 30% who didn't like it really hated it. And the thing is, the people who are negative on internet are the loudest and the most annoying, and they make the memes and everything. And granted, I've made a few memes in my time, but as Josh or anyone else who knows me is aware of, when I make a meme, it's often just a parody of other memes. But as much as also some memes have made me laugh over time, I feel the meme has become the editorial of the imbecile. It's people who can't express an opinion in more than 5 words. And I don't mean to sound elitist when I say this, but it's just so often when you see memes, it almost looks like they're made by the most ignorant, dumbest people you can find.
It's a knee jerk reaction, is what it is. I mean, and there's validity to that. It's the meme is the gut feeling of the editorial world. It's the quick blurb and that's it. No exposition on the meme, no exposition on the thought, just the thought, and then they let it out there and then it festers.
Yeah, I've had Facebook statuses that are manifestos compared to what memes are, and by manifesto I probably mean like 3 sentences. But I kind of think that's an indictment on people's ability to properly express themselves. And hey, there are certainly many user-generated sites, and if you want to express your opinion, go on one of them and
Yeah,
write an
just
actual
spend an hour on Reddit and get it out of your system. I will say this before you go on a little bit more, and I want to touch on more. And again, it has to do with the critical nature of basically not only this film but just in general. And it's an analogy that I have of how I felt like the negative feedback on this film in particular, but other films as well, and other things in general as well. People don't just not like things anymore. They tend to hate them vehemently, and I don't know if it's disingenuous. Or, I don't know. I mean, literally, we're talking everything from the political climate to Amazon reviews, and the reason I mention Amazon reviews is because you can go on to look up a product. Just look up any product on Amazon that isn't out yet. Like look up a pre-order product, and you will see a litany. That is, if Amazon hasn't changed their rules recently, you'll see a litany of 1-star reviews for a product that isn't out yet, and it's only because they couldn't give it 0 stars. And you'll see this very often amongst box sets of films, specifically, very films with loyal fan bases. Think Lord of the Rings, think The Hobbit, think the Dark Knight trilogy, and they will give reviews for something that they don't like, rather than giving it a reasonable review of saying, okay, well, this has a very significant lack of quality in its craft, or it has way less features than the standard Blu-ray had. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. No, I'm going to give it a 1 out of 10. I'm going to give it the absolute lowest rating that it can possibly get. And I think that really that's even one of the reasons that 71% of fans on Rotten Tomatoes, for example, I think that's a reason that number is honestly not higher. I think that a lot more fans like that film a lot more. I just think that these people are not being critically honest. They're not even being honest, I think, with themselves. I think that if you could, I have not talked to a single person, even people who I know who claim that they hate this movie. I have not talked to a single person who would give this movie a 1 out of 10 rating, but I have seen dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of them online. I've also seen dozens and dozens of 5-star ratings, which I didn't even give it a 5 out of 5. But my point is that I think that people are being disingenuous in their critique, and I think that you can dislike something, dislike something a lot, but to say, okay, well, it has absolutely no qualities whatsoever that are meritorious, I think it's disingenuous, and I'll get more into that later when I give my individual review. But go ahead, Eric. Let's start talking about, because we're gonna get really long-winded here if we continue this rate. Let's get into a little bit of what did you like about the movie, what did you not like about the movie, and then we'll kind of do a little back and forth.
Yeah, I usually save my score when we do our oral reviews on this show to the end of talking about a movie. But since I already have a written review out there, I will preface by saying I gave this movie a 9 out of 10. And as you said, there were people giving 1 out of 10, and that's quite disingenuous. But because this movie in no way was a 1 out of 10, and if you're someone who's listening to this show right now and you didn't like it, that's fine. I mean, as long as people can express their opinions well, we respect them. But at the same time, people who who just say this movie sucked or whatever, yeah, that's a different, much different story. Because the movie was shot well, it was directed well. I think the characters were written very close to how they were in the comics. But keep in mind, a 9 out of 10 is not a 10 out of 10. I didn't think the movie was perfect. There were issues with editing, which Josh will probably go into maybe a little more because he's seen the movie twice. And perhaps we'll see things. Maybe things will flow better when we actually get the ultimate cut, which is a half hour longer as a home video release in July. Um, but yeah, as we go into talking about it, I was just going to say that the way this is actually getting pretty ugly on social media, not to, to expand too much, but it's leading into what I'm going to talk about. Um, the two things I never like discussing on Facebook in any form are religion and politics. Um, because as in real life, they divide people. So I don't really express anything having to do with those on Facebook. Um, but comic book movies are now in the category of religion and politics because when you argue about them, it gets freaking ugly and it's getting pretty bad. But anyway, we're now here to talk something positive. And what I did like about this movie was, first, I'd say something that even people who didn't like the movie said was good, and how people were just dumping so much shit on for the past 3 years. Ben Affleck. I mean, the guy was an awesome, awesome Batman. And I'm willing to say he's the best in live action. He's come the closest to what I've wanted to see for the comic, a representation of the comic book Batman. Some people didn't think he was the world's greatest detective, but from what we did see, I did think he was at least a portrayal of the smartest Batman in live action. Okay, yes, Adam West's Batman was a defined genius, and I'll give it that. Michael Keaton's Batman was pretty smart, but Christopher Nolan's Batman, as great as it was, the guy needed Lucius Fox to make his gadgets for him, and this Batman in no way needed that. I liked how he had that experienced, collected nature about him. He felt very at home in the Batcave and putting pieces of the puzzle together. We see him making his own gadgets and weapons. Alfred, of course, I think Jeremy Irons was a great Alfred, and the relationship between them was, done rather well. He had that sarcastic nature to Bruce, like, yeah, you're going to kill yourself out there one day, but I still am in essence your surrogate father. And there's just this unspoken bond between them. I thought that was captured well. I believe I've said on the show before, I'm really happy with the costume. We finally got the black and gray on screen, and it looks better than any Batman costume that preceded it. It shows that it's possible to capture that look. I got sick of the all black look. I mean, it was cool in Tim Burton's movies, but everyone has just fallen into that mindset. Um, the fighting was great. Granted, a bit of that's a stunt double, but to see a Batman that does more than just get into fist fights and look like he's ripped out of one of the Arkham games, that was a real treat to see. That warehouse fight was, I don't know, it was incredible to watch. And as I said, this very much was a comic book Batman, but there was a huge dose of Frank Miller in there. I think my dog has something to say about it. You might hear her in the background. Uh, but yeah, there was a lot of Frank Miller influence here, and not just the mech suit and fight against Superman. Um, he did pretty much kill people, but we can't really dwell on that too much because pretty much every cinematic version of Batman has killed someone. I mean, Michael Keaton's Batman strapped a bomb to a fat guy and smiled about it. I mean, he killed so many of the Joker's henchmen in the '89 film. They dialed it back for the Schumacher films, though that was still in the same continuity. And Josh and I have always had this running joke about when Val Kilmer's Batman was talking to Dick Grayson in the Batman. He's like, "So you're willing to take a life?" And my response every time, and it gets sweeter every
It
time.
gets sweeter every time. Feeling
Um,
of godlike power, forced to kill again.
yeah. Um, and then Nolan's Batman, whether you want to admit it or not, it's a gray area, but he killed Ra's al Ghul. He killed Harvey Dent. I'm sorry, pushing a guy off a ledge a few stories up, causing him to break his neck. That's murder. I'm sorry.
Blowing up a building full of ninjas while they're all inside, including a helpless farmer. Yeah, he killed a few people in those movies, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
He just was indirect. He was indirectly responsible. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Affleck's Batman was a little more indirectly responsible. If you know The Dark Knight Returns, you could call his dialogue and actions in a few scenes, like when he killed the guy that was, essentially KG Beast shooting his fuel tank. I believe you. That was that was pretty much out of The Dark Knight Returns. They just swapped a member of the mutant gang that he pretty much shot in the face or something. But yeah, I was very satisfied with Batman, and as much as I'm looking forward to Justice League, and yes, Justice League needs to be the next movie with Batman, and it goes into production April 11th, so we're getting it whether you want it or not. Uh, but as much as I want to see other DC Universe movies after Justice League, we already know Affleck's working on a solo Batman movie with Jeff Johns. It's come out in various press outlets, but I'm just saying, after Justice League, please fast track a movie with and Affleck's Batman. I want to see it. I just think that whatever Affleck and Johns are cooking up, no matter what you feel about Zack Snyder, Ben Affleck is an award-winning director, and I just feel that whatever Batman movie he's going to create with Jeff Johns is going to absolutely blow every cinematic Batman offering out of the water. And people can say, "Oh, like what about Kevin Conroy?" Kevin Conroy is an awesome Batman voice, but I don't like lumping them together because I consider live action cinema and animation to be two completely different realms. Like I would never ever cast Kevin Conroy as a live action Batman. I probably wouldn't even cast Diedrich Bader or Bruce Greenwood, other guys who have done great Batman voices. Jason O'Mara, though, I could see him though as a live
Yeah,
action Batman.
Jason O'Mara would be an okay Batman. Just like I'm sure it would be a different take, but just like who is it? Had Jerry O'Connell done a take on Superman at one point, or did he do Billy Batson?
I believe he was up for the role in Superman Returns, possibly J.J. Abrams' Superman Flyby, which is shit canned. But it's funny enough, if you're someone who owns the Superman Returns strategy guide for the video game, there was a poster included in there, and I don't know if you remember it, Josh, but you might be able to look it up. Though we're talking a 10-year-old video game, so it could be buried in image searches, but the poster provided in that strategy guide, it's supposed to be Brandon Routh's Superman, and it's obviously a computer generated image to promote a video game, but the Superman in there looked way more like Jerry O'Connell, at least in that poster, than it did Brandon Routh. But anyway, yeah, other characters, Wonder Woman was a standout. Granted, we didn't see too much of her, but everyone is just talking about how badass she was, and some people thought she was a show stealer. We need to see a little more of Gal Gadot's acting and the gravitas she'll bring to Wonder Woman, but I think that film will shape up to be something great. I mean, she was awesome in that Doomsday fight. I did I felt a little bit of surprise when she kept her Israeli accent, but it made sense because Wonder Woman is from a remote exotic island, and for her not to have an American accent actually made a bit of sense when you think about it. Um, Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor was certainly divisive. In fact, people who liked the movie seem to hate him. I think if you at least look at how the character is written, he certainly is Lex Luthor. He's very xenophobic. He's a genius. He's arrogant. I especially thought when he's away from the public eye in the scene with Holly Hunter, the senator, she he came off as very intimidating, and he doesn't care who he threatens. Um, but personally, his performance, yes, he was a bit neurotic at times, but I did like him. I He brought a different sense to the Lex Luthor character, but I do like how he presented it. Perhaps my feelings will change with repeated viewings. They tend to in movies, but I mean, granted, he's not Michael Rosenbaum, who I still think is the king of Luthors. I don't believe anyone has surpassed him as of yet, but people are saying, "Oh, the Lex Luthor Jr. thing." Don't forget that technically, before the New 52, his legal name was Alexander Luthor Jr., and I think that's why they went with it in this movie. Um, they could have easily said his father's name was Lionel Luthor, but this isn't Smallville. They show allusions to his dad that he was an abusive father, and but if they ever wanted to do a mea culpa or a retcon, they could always bring in Lex Luthor Sr., but I think this is probably the DC Extended Universe's definitive version of Lex Luthor. But if they wanted to, and they say like, hey, we want to include Lex Luthor in future movies, they could have Lex Luthor Sr. step up, take the control of the company, and they could just call an audible. You never know, and they could just leave Lex Luthor Jr. in prison. I kind of think they should stick to their guns, but if they feel the character Jesse Eisenberg was that reviled and they have big plans for Lex Luthor in the future, do what you need to do, but just show that Lex Luthor is of the same mindset. And hey, it sounds like he's a meaner guy than Junior. So just find the right guy. It's too bad we can't go in a time machine and have Telly Savalas play Lex Luthor, because I still think he'd be my ideal Luthor if you could pluck someone from any era. I mean, they even used him as a template for Superman the Animated Series. Doomsday, I liked him. CGI could have been better, and he did go through mutations, but he didn't get much bonier than what we saw in trailer 2. Um, it I just I'm glad they had the balls to do the death of Superman. And some people say, hey, it was too soon to do the death of Superman or have Doomsday kill him. It's only the second movie in a franchise, but hey, it's certainly not the second Superman movie ever made. And when you're looking at movies, you can't do what you can do on a TV show with 20 episodes. You're doing a much truncated version than you do in other forms of media, and you have to get that across. And hey, doing the death of Superman, the sacrifice that he gave, earn back the public's trusts. I mean, granted, they think he's dead. The last shot of the movie, we know Superman's coming back. We've read comics, Superman will be resurrected. If you keep up with movie news, Henry Cavill is in Justice League, though I don't think he's going to be showing up till the second or third act, because it's going to be Batman who's the one who's going to round up the Justice League and say, hey, we need more people, superpowers to counter future threats because something is on the way, and we know that Darkseid is coming. And the Flash, is poking through the Speed Force trying to let Bruce know that something's coming and to avoid this possible future, and it keep Lois Lane alive. And people are like, oh, why is Lois Lane such a big part? And I think the Injustice game might have played an influence on this movie, because Lois is what keeps Superman tethered to humanity in a way. And if he lost that woman, we see the Superman in this vision, this dystopic future. He completely lost his humanity, and he's possibly a subordinate of Darkseid, possibly also taking some influence from Earth 2 comics, even though Brutal was just a clone of Superman. And we are throwing in quite a few nods here for people who read comic books as opposed to those who don't. But I also do think that maybe Zack Snyder took it for granted that too many people were reading comic books, because a lot of people found the nightmare sequence to be disorienting and out of place. Whereas, Josh and I are watching, we're like, yeah, this is freaking awesome. But when you do pull yourself back, Zack Snyder was more so giving a shout to comic book fans. And the other Justice League cameos were just that, cameos. This was not the bloated, how are you going to do all these characters in 2.5 hours that people were saying. No, they really were just cameos, and this was Batman and Superman movie with a Wonder Woman to a sense. But again, I applaud them for having the balls to go through with the death of Superman, because I think superhero movies, there have been so many of them, have fallen into a formula and a comfort zone, and we need to start taking risks. Just as Marvel needs to pull the trigger on Steve Rogers at some point to show there are consequences. The only time in some superhero movies when you get someone who dies, it's Quicksilver in Age of Ultron, a character that was introduced in that movie, so it doesn't seem too consequential. So even if Steve Rogers doesn't die in Civil War, he might in Infinity War Part 1 or something like that. But we need to show that superhero movies are willing to take risks, and that's what I admire about Batman versus Superman, is that it wasn't just another comic book movie. And someone asked me after we did a live stream of another show, live from Junkie Nation, which we'll plug again before the show is over. Someone asked me if I was satisfied as a comic book fan, and I said yes, because historically Batman and Superman don't get along when they first meet in various forms of media. So we got to see them fight, and we got to see them team up toward the end of the movie. Granted, I prefer Superman and Batman as best buddies. Like, the dynamic captured between them in Superman, Batman, and Public Enemies, which is one of my favorite comic book arcs and was adapted to a fine animated film. When we get to Justice League and stuff, I want to see that dynamic captured. But what we got in this movie, yes, I am satisfied with it, because it keeps in line with how these men first react to each other. And people are like, oh, Superman said Martha, instant besties. That's another one of those cynical memes that I think are too simple-minded these days. It was the point, before I hand it over to Josh, I at least got to get a few thoughts out here. There were a few reasons why the movie started with Batman and his parents getting shot. Not only was it to establish this was a different continuity of films, and this wasn't Christopher Nolan's Batman, because people still have not gotten that disconnect. It was to show the impacts that event still has on Batman's life, even when he's been Batman for 20 years. This is a 45-year-old Batman in a sense, and situations have grown to him becoming darker. He lost Robin 10 years ago, which Zack Snyder said. The arrival of Superman has caused him to become much more severe on criminals. And in a way, it does make sense when you're examining Batman as somewhat of a real world character. Now, Batman, it wasn't like, oh, your mom's name is Martha too. Oh, that's cool. Let's be besties. No, that's not what it was. Batman is a man who, although he has a great heart, no matter how tough he is on criminals, he does actually love his fellow man as a whole and consistently puts his life on the line for him. But if you look back earlier in the movie, what the first thing he sees of Superman is a man who he blames is destroying Metropolis, and if he wanted to, could burn the whole place down, as he says. He loses a friend at his company, and he sees a girl get orphaned. He wants to make sure this man never makes an orphan of anyone again. And when he gets the realization that Martha is going to die, it kind of triggers something in his head. It's not a psychotic break. It's nothing that severe, but it's, I will not let Martha die. It's a chance to redeem, to do something that child Bruce couldn't do. That was the point of it. And when you realize this man is being goaded into trying to harm me, he steps back and thinks, maybe Superman isn't the villain I thought he was. And they eventually earn each other's trust. That was the point of that. And people really need to do some critical thinking. And I don't even know if I could call that critical thinking, because I got that instantaneously in the theater. But anyway, I'll perhaps bring up other points eventually, but as I said, I will have my review linked. By now, you pretty much know what I thought of the movie, what I liked, and a few things maybe I didn't like. But all in all, this was a movie I loved, and I do like what Zack Snyder brought us, and he capably handled it better than a lot of filmmakers would, because it was a passion project. So, Josh, let's hear your thoughts.
All right, so that was a little long-winded. I'll try to keep it concise and tight as possible. But so things that I liked. First things first, I liked the fact that they kind of did a little bit of back and forth between Batman and Superman throughout the course of the film. It was definitely very much a sequel to Man of Steel, which people had some concerns about, and then putting too much emphasis on Batman. Did they put too much emphasis on Batman? Perhaps they did. But obviously this is, the cinematic introduction of this character again, in this particular universe. So I thought it was obviously important for the director and the direction of the extended universe going forward for it to be new and fresh in people's minds, and point out the differences between this Batman and another Batman. But Eric brings up some really fine points. So I mean, getting into a little bit of spoilery territory, but nothing we haven't necessarily seen in trailers, and that is that when the very film starts, we get a kind of a flashback to obviously the death of Bruce's parents. And again, the reason that they did bring it up is because they wanted to point out the fact that it was still this life-altering, tragic event. I mean, it's quite literally still the reason that he's Batman. It's, I will never let someone become an orphan again because of criminality. Very classic, 1940s Batman stuff. And it's still the story today. I mean, they haven't retconned it. They haven't changed it. They've shown us various iterations of it, but it's never been any different than that. And then they instantly jump into, okay, let's go from what created Batman to what brings Batman back out of retirement. And he sees the destruction of Metropolis during the Superman fight. Now, we go on all about Man of Steel in a different review, and we have, in fact, we could talk about that at length. But they show, quite literally, one of the most kind of, I thought for me, it's this really gritty emotional scene, and it's really points out one of the most stringent causes for his transformation into, like, I might have to destroy Superman mentality that he has. And he sees this girl, this little girl, almost getting crushed by a building. Filmed in Detroit, by the way, which is awesome. I think Eric got to see that scene or that set.
Yeah, I was there during the much destruction of Metropolis.
Yeah, it was shot in Detroit, and there's you can see that if you're a local, it's pretty neat. You can kind of see where some of the stuff is filmed. But so they show this building almost falling, or after Zod crashes into the building in Man of Steel, he goes crazy with his heat vision. It's the first time he blasts his heat vision, and he destroys the entire building. Well, it was the Wayne Financial building, so we see it from Bruce's perspective. And so he jumps in and he saves this little girl, and he says, where are your parents? And so she points up, and you assume she's pointing up at the building, right? Well, but then they pan up. They give you the money shot. They pan up and they give you the shot, and the building has literally been cut basically past the 10th story. The building is gone. It's just absolutely does not exist anymore.
And I was there.
and it was one of those things where it was like, okay, I just literally watched this girl become an orphan. He just literally watched, the creation, the thing that created Batman. He just watched this with another person, and if this girl had superpowers, it would make sense if she says, I'm going to fight all Kryptonians in the future because they're all evil or something. But, I think that it came from a very organic and real place. And I think that a lot of people, when, now moving all the way to the end of the film is after the fight between Batman and Superman, it's, that people are, memeing it like crazy and making fun of it. Oh, your mom's name's Martha too. Cool. Let's be best buddies. Yeah. And it's absurd because what it does is it is disingenuous. But it's an extremely subtle influencing thing. And I actually read it a little bit differently than you did, Eric. You kind of read it as, hey, I'm not, if this is my only chance to stop another person's parents from being killed, or this is my chance to, save this Martha that I couldn't save my own, then I'll do it. The way I actually saw it is one thing that they touch on in the film is Batman's got some extreme xenophobia, and they touch on it throughout the film, and I think that's why they had this dichotomy between Batman and Superman. Some people talked about the fact that the Batman scenes seem to have more spunk and a little bit more speed and were more fast paced, and then the Superman stuff was a little bit more slow and plodding. But they did this showcase of like Superman vignettes, for lack of a better way to put it, where they show him being Superman, right? They show him saving a space capsule and saving people during a flood, and there's this just amazing shot of him pulling this gigantic tanker ship through the ice by its just enormous chain, and it just looks like something straight out of like an Alex Ross print. It's absolutely incredible, and I think that they were kind of showing the othering of Superman. It's like he's this god amongst men who's doing these things that people can't even fathom, and they're also talking about his place in the world, and that goes towards what Eric was talking about, the fact that they're bringing in these thematic elements that I think are way more mature than anything in any other comic book movie. And if you think that I'm wrong on that, I'd love to have a debate with you about it. Because I don't know of another comic book movie other than, say, Watchmen, that is talking about really gritty, realistic, thematic elements if you had superheroes living in those worlds. Even coming to Captain America 3, they have a mention of the fact that we're just now getting an actual human and public response to the Avengers being around, and they've been around for 2 films, and there's been so much crazy stuff that's happened in their individual films. And before I get off the mark, bringing it back to my point is that they showed this othering of Superman as this thing that exists in humanity's, on humanity's earth, right? This thing that's kind of ununderstandable and unbelievable, and it's quite literally super and spectacular. And so Batman sees him as this extraordinary other, and he's heavily xenophobic towards him. And you see in the trailer, if there's even a 1% chance, I have to take it as an absolute certainty, because otherwise, he burn the whole earth down. And you get his legitimate fear from that. And I think that what happens is at the end of their fight, he hears him say Martha, and he keeps thinking about him as an alien. And there's even a part in the fight where he hits Superman with kryptonite, which of course that's the only way he fights Superman, right? He hits Superman with kryptonite, and he blocks his punch, and he says, "You're not brave. Only men can be brave," right? You know, it's the kind of the idea, like, if you can't be hurt, then you don't need bravery. You only need. It's one of the greatest things about the concept of bravery. You know, you hear people talking about stories of bravery, you know, to children, and it's like, well, Dad, you know, how can I be brave if I'm scared? Well, that's the only way you can be brave, is if you're overcoming the fear of whatever you're trying to tackle, and you do it anyway in spite of it. You know, that's the definition of bravery. And so, you know, Bruce's mentality, or Batman's mentality, is, you know, Superman doesn't need bravery because he's invulnerable. You know, so then he hits him with the kryptonite, makes him a little bit more immortal, and says, you know, as the fight continues, he then says, you know, you were never a god, you weren't even a man. And then instantly he finds out about Martha, the fact that, you know, Superman's mother gets kidnapped by Lex Luthor's villains, and that the whole catalyst for the fight, really, or one of the various catalysts for the fight, is that Superman is told by Lex Luthor, you know, bring me the head of Batman, or I'm going to kill your mother. So he doesn't go there to fight. He goes there to plead Batman to help him. And so at the very end, he says, you know, you're letting him kill Martha. And I think at that point, Batman kind of goes, holy shit, I've been thinking about this guy as not only an alien, like an absolutely inhuman alien, this person who can't even fathom what it's like to be a human and live in a world with a god. And then he's like, dude's got a mother named Martha. Like, I think he realizes the humanity of Superman that he was trying so hard not to see. And then I think at that point, Batman literally backs off in fear of himself. And I think he realizes, and I'll say this, and aside from Doomsday and aside from Lex Luthor, that as far as the Batman versus Superman fight, Batman is the villain of the film. Batman really is the bad guy, in terms of their conflict. And he realizes that he's not only in the wrong, but he realizes it in such a way that he's like, you know, I will now do anything that I can to help save your mother. So I think that's the kind of very subtle nuance that this film had that people seem to be overlooking significantly. And touching on a few other things, because I don't want to get super long in my review, though. But yeah, I actually broke down the movie, and I suggest that you do the same if you think the movie you know, is poor, or if you think the movie's great. But I broke it down on 11 points. I broke it down basically on all of the things that critics tend to analyze movies on, and on all but a very few things. So editing, even directing, I gave the film very high marks, and my overall score is about 8 to 8.5 out of 10. And the only reason I marked it as low is the editing the movie does, especially on a second viewing. You know, upon a first viewing, the excitement of seeing it definitely outweighed, for me personally, the slow plotting nature of its plot. It's a slow burn, but not in a Mad Men kind of way. It's a slow burn in that they're slowly building tension over the course of the movie until it explodes at the end with this fight between Batman and Superman, and then eventually the fight between Doomsday and Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. But I thought that so many of the things were great. The acting was spectacular. You can and here's another thing. You don't have to like Eisenberg's take on Luthor. Answer me this question. Do you think that he acted it poorly? Do you think that his acting for that direction of the character was poorly done? And the answer is no. I would say that even people who didn't like his take would say that he wasn't acting poorly. I did an extraordinary job. I think Eisenberg's a great actor. If anyone we have to blame for you know, Eisenberg's take on Luthor, it's either Snyder, or if you want to get really meta, it's Max Landis, because he directed he wrote the screenplay for Eisenberg's American Ultra, and people have said that Eisenberg's take on Luthor was almost like a parody of Max Landis himself, who's a very flamboyant and garish character of a man. He's a very interesting guy. He's got some great stuff you can check out on YouTube. But
Yeah, who also writes a very awesome Superman comic called American Alien that
Right.
we'd recommend you check out.
Yeah, you should definitely check that out. Maybe the best comic book representation of Luther I've ever seen. Um, but the point is that that's not a fault of Jesse Eisenberg by any stretch of the imagination. So I thought it was really, really well acted. I thought Affleck knocked it out of the park as Bruce Wayne / Batman. Cavill is definitely a Superman. I mean, again, you don't have to like the characteristical take on Superman if you're a lover of the classical Superman and you thought that this is not my Superman. Okay, I understand if you don't like the narrative reception or the narrative take on the character, but he acts he acts like this character. He truly shows you the what it would be like to be a god amongst men. There's a great scene of Clark sitting down on a couch and hearing a TV, talking heads basically saying, yeah, should Superman even do this? That's the question we need to ask. And, he's just kind of saying to himself, you can see it in his emotion. You can see he's kind of saying to himself, "Man, all I want to do is help people. All I'm trying to do is what I think that I can and what I need to do, which is, do what anyone else would do." I mean, if you're a genius mathematician, there's almost no question that they're going to put their extraordinary talents to work for the betterment of mankind. You've got someone like a Michio Kaku or Neil deGrasse Tyson. Yeah, these are geniuses. They're not going to go be plumbers. No, they're putting their amazing brains to work for the betterment of humanity. So, why would you have a guy who has powers just be a reporter? And not to say that there isn't merit in that, but he finds himself, overcoming the idea that, I have to do more. I can't even do what my dad wanted, which is to, stay away from society because they couldn't possibly understand you. Well, the funny thing is they kind of touch on the fact that there's validity in what Pa Kent said. Yeah, there are portions of humanity that don't understand him, don't appreciate him, and that in the case of Luther want him to be harmed. But yeah, it was well acted. The cinematography was beautiful. No one will question that Snyder presents, these beautiful scenes. I mean, like I said, there's frames of this movie that look like straight out of comic book art, and various other segments of the film, tenets of the film that you would grade a film on, I think excelled. And I honestly thought that the narrative was great, but I think it was edited poorly. I do think it was edited poorly, and it's one of the things that knocks the review down. I gave it on its editing scale. I gave it about a 6.5 or a 7, and the only reason is on the second viewing, it does feel like some of the scenes are connected poorly, and they're a little discombobulated. I don't think that they take away from the narrative, though, and I don't think that they made the film hard to follow. And I don't consider myself a genius by any stretch of the imagination, but I will say this: a lot of the reviews that I read amongst these elitist critics is that they found the film hard to follow, and almost no one that I've talked to, even people who didn't like the film and people who loved it, did not find the film hard to follow. But I will say this: Lex Luthor's plot to literally bring about the fight between Man of Steel and Knight of Gotham, I thought it was exceptionally well done. It's this extraordinarily nuanced plot where he crafts social and public perception of Superman in a negative way intentionally, because he knows that Batman and Bruce Wayne are the same person, but also that he knows that he wants to bring Batman and Superman into conflict. So when you see the trailer and you see that scene, oh, I'm bringing Clark Kent and Superman and Bruce Wayne together. Well, I mean, why would Lex Luthor know who cub reporter, Clark Kent even is? Well, it's because he knows who Superman. He knows he's Superman already. This is the smartest Lex Luthor we've ever seen. This is not the bumbling idiot, Gene Hackman, with some ridiculous land plot, land grab scheme from the Superman, the early Superman films. It's not even It's not even variations of what we've seen in some of the animated films, but I thought rather it was a great amalgamation of pretty much almost every Luthor we've ever seen. But now I'm getting long winded. So I'll say this. Let me look at my scoring here. So yeah, the plot, themes and tones, acting and characters, direction, score, cinematography, production design, special effects, editing, pace, dialogue, and then overall score. So the pace and the editing are the only things that I really gave it a very low score on, which is I think I gave it a 6.5 for each of those. 6.5 or 7 out of 10. And it's only because, yes, upon a second viewing, the editing does seem a bit choppy. It doesn't seem to go in a very fluid way from point to point to point. Again, not enough to take you out of the story. But for people who are particularly critical of film, and I'm not saying this movie, but of film in general, they're going to find those things a little bit hard to swallow. But again, I don't think that they take away from the plot. Like Eric said, Wonder Woman was a highlight. She was exceptional. Ben Affleck was exceptional. I thought Eisenberg did a great job. I even thought Holly Hunter, for what should have been a throwaway character that no one gave a shit about, she gave her A+ effort for that character. Even Lawrence Fishburne, who was kind of throwaway in Man of Steel, I thought he did a great job, as he was very much a classic style Perry White. Here's the splash line. Here's what I want to read, Clark. And I thought he did a really good job. And people bashed on Amy Adams, Lois Lane. I still don't think she was perfect casting for that, but I do think that she did a great job with the character. I don't think there was too much romance in the film. I don't think that it was. There's literally maybe 10 minutes of it in the whole of the film. So I don't think the people who are saying that there's too much are being honest. But that being said, I gave the film an 8.5. If you haven't seen it, you need to go see the film. I thought it was really, really well done. It's one of the better comic book films in terms of representing what we've seen in the comics, giving it actual legitimate weight in a real world, talking thematically about things that would actually present themselves if these characters existed in amongst humanity. And then giving us this epic confrontation finally between Batman and Superman. And the only thing that, if I'm being super nitpicky, is the fight should have been more even. The fight should have been more even between Superman and Batman. And I'll leave it at that. But Eric, any other thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, we are about out of time for this episode. But yeah, I did mention it in my written review. I will agree with you that although Batman's my favorite hero, and as some of you may remember, Superman's my second, that fight was a bit lopsided in Batman's favor. But we both think we've pretty much made most of our finer points regarding this movie. As I said, I will have my written review linked in the article. And if you have any other questions for us regarding this movie, feel free to comment on the article or on Facebook. We'll do our best to get back to you. We know it's been a while since our last episode. We will probably have some sort of episode for you to look forward to next weekend. There's a returning guest we're looking at having coming back. It might be a little shorter than you're used to, but we've given him a chance to plug an endeavor of his, and we always like making good on our promises, and when we can, bringing a special guest to our listeners. So just keep an eye for about a week from now, and other things in the future you can look forward to. Obviously, we're going to be reviewing Captain America Civil War after that comes out, because we're obviously looking forward to that at an extreme level. And as always, I will plug our links for all the latest Batman news across all forms of media, and just a plethora of reviews. Go to darkknightnews.com. for the latest DC Comics news across all forms of media, please visit dccomicsnews.com. And then for our backlog of podcasts and other miscellanea, even though we haven't updated our blog as much lately, please check out multiverseentertainment.wordpress.com. Although it's not affiliated with the show, please check out wegotThisCovered.com. It's a great entertainment site I write for. And since we've been appearing, both Josh and I have almost become somewhat regular appearances, although it's more so us appearing on a panel live from Junkie Nation on their YouTube channel. Please check out culturejunkies.net. We've also been linking some of those videos on our Facebook page as well, which brings us to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/a podcast for all seasons. So until next time, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. If you do like what you heard, or if you have any thoughts or comments, please give us a holler on Facebook, comment on YouTube, and we'll try to do our best to get back to you. But have a good night.